There are some murder cases where the killer leaves behind a weapon. Some leave fingerprints, some leave blood, and some leave behind something far more disturbing. A room full of people who already suspect the truth. On the night of April 16, 1960, a 25-year-old schoolteacher named Irene Garza left her family home in McAllen, Texas. She was not going somewhere dangerous. She was not meeting a stranger. She was not disappearing into the night. She was going to church. It was Holy Saturday, the day before Easter, and Irene had done this before. She was a devout Catholic woman who regularly attended Mass and confession. That evening, she went to Sacred Heart Catholic Church, where she expected to perform one of the most ordinary rituals of her faith. Instead, she would walk into the last place she would ever be seen alive. And the person who would later become the only identified suspect in her murder was a Catholic priest. Welcome to Cold Crime Chronicles, where we uncover cold cases. If you are new to this channel, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss new updates. Like this video as well. Now, back to the case. His name was John Bernard Fite. He was 27 years old. He was visiting the parish during the busy Easter season. And according to investigators, he was the last known person to see Irene alive. What happened inside that church that night would remain disputed for decades. But what happened afterward was not. Irene never came home. At first, her parents waited. Perhaps she had stayed for the Easter services. Perhaps she had visited someone. Perhaps there had simply been a delay. But the hours passed. By approximately 3 in the morning, the uncertainty had become terror. Irene's parents went to the McAllen Police Department and reported their daughter missing. And almost immediately, the city began searching. The search would become one of the largest volunteer searches the Rio Grande Valley had seen at that time. People looked along roads, they searched fields, they examined canals, they followed rumors. They searched for a woman who, only hours earlier, had left home expecting to return. Then, days later, pieces of the mystery began appearing in the landscape. A purse, a shoe, a lace veil. Items associated with Irene were found along a road, separated from one another, as though something terrible had happened somewhere between the church and wherever she had been taken. Then came the discovery that transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a murder investigation. On April 21st, Irene Garza's body was found floating in an irrigation canal. The young woman who had left home for confession was dead. The autopsy determined that she had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and suffocated. But the most frightening question was not how Irene died. It was who had been with her before she died. And investigators did not have to search far for the first name: John Fite. The priest who had been hearing confessions that evening. The man Irene had gone to see. The man who acknowledged that he had spoken with her. And the man whose own explanations about that night would become one of the central mysteries of the case. There was also something else. A small object found near the area where Irene's body had been dumped. An Eastman Kodak slide viewer. Police appealed to the public for help identifying its owner. Then, astonishingly, John Fite contacted the police. He told them the slide viewer belonged to him. That single admission did not prove murder. But it placed Fite in an increasingly uncomfortable position. Why was an object belonging to the priest near the place where Irene's body had been found? Why had Irene been taken away from the church? Why did Fite give investigators different accounts of what happened that evening? And why, only weeks before Irene's murder, had another young woman accused Fite of attacking her inside a church? The answers would not arrive quickly. In fact, they would take more than half a century. The investigation of 1960 would stall. The suspect would leave Texas. He would marry. He would have children. He would become a grandfather. And Irene's family would continue living with a question that had no answer. Who killed their daughter? But even then, justice did not come immediately. Irene had been dead for 57 years. But this case is not simply about a murder. It is about what happens when suspicion arrives before evidence is strong enough to secure a conviction. It is about what happens when witnesses remain silent. It is about the terrible distance between knowing something and proving it. And above all, it is about a young woman who entered a church seeking peace and never came home. This is the story of Irene Garza. To discover the shocking twist in this case, you need to watch till the end. Before Irene Garza became the name attached to one of Texas's most notorious cold cases, she was simply Irene, a daughter, a teacher, a friend, a young woman with ambitions, faith, and a future that appeared to be opening in front of her. She was born on November 15, 1934. By the time she was 25, Irene had already accomplished something unusual for a young Mexican-American woman of her generation. She had graduated from college. She had become a teacher. She had earned recognition for her beauty. And she was deeply involved in the Catholic community around her. She had been her high school's first Latina drum majorette and had also received beauty pageant honors, including the title Miss All South Texas Sweetheart. But reducing Irene to her appearance misses the person her family and friends remembered. She was educated, religious, ambitious, and increasingly confident. In a letter written shortly before her death, Irene described the effect her religious faith had been having on her life. She wrote about attending Mass and receiving communion daily, and about the courage and happiness that faith had given her. That letter would become haunting after her death, because Irene was writing about life at a moment when she had no reason to believe that her own life was about to end. She was also working as a teacher, including with children who came from disadvantaged backgrounds. To those who knew her, she represented possibility, and that made her disappearance even harder for McAllen to comprehend. This was not a woman who had simply vanished from a troubled life. She had parents, she had friends, she had a community, she had plans. And on April 16th, she told her parents that she was going to Sacred Heart Catholic Church for confession. Nothing about that decision would have seemed strange. It was Holy Saturday. Easter was approaching. The church would have been busy. Priests were hearing confessions as parishioners prepared for the holiday. Among those priests was John Bernard Fite. Fite was only 27 years old. He was not Irene's regular priest. He was a visiting priest helping during the Easter period, and that detail would become crucial, because the night Irene disappeared, Fite told investigators that he had heard her confession, but even this apparently straightforward fact became complicated. The confession was not conducted in the way investigators might have expected. Fite eventually said that he had heard Irene's confession inside the rectory. A face-to-face confession in the rectory was considered unusual under the circumstances. That meant Irene had not simply entered a conventional confessional, spoken through a screen and left. She had been alone with Fite in a more private setting. And according to the investigation, she was never seen alive again. At first, however, nobody knew that. When Irene failed to return home, her family waited. The family initially believed she might have remained at the church for the Easter vigil, but by approximately 3 a.m., that explanation no longer seemed sufficient. Her parents went to the police. The search began. The next few days became a nightmare of uncertainty. People searched roads and fields. Volunteers joined law enforcement. The entire community became aware that something was terribly wrong. Then came the first strange clues. On April 18th, people found Irene's purse, her left shoe, and her lace mantilla along a road. The items were not all together. They appeared along a trail stretching for several hundred yards. And suddenly investigators had a new question. Had Irene been attacked somewhere? Had she been transported? Had she escaped from someone? Or had someone deliberately scattered her belongings? There were also false leads. A woman called Irene's family and claimed to be Irene, saying she had been kidnapped and taken to a hotel in nearby Hidalgo. The story was investigated and determined to be false. Another person told an Edinburgh waitress that he had killed Irene. That statement was ultimately dismissed as a drunken joke. For the Garza family, however, none of these false leads were harmless. Every rumor created hope. Every rumor had to be checked. And every dead end returned them to the same unbearable reality. Irene was still missing. Then, on April 21st, the search reached an irrigation canal. Irene's body was discovered floating in the water. She had been dead for days. The medical examination revealed a violent attack. She had suffered blows to the head. She had been sexually assaulted. And she had died from suffocation. The water had also destroyed or compromised potential evidence. Whatever traces might once have existed, hair, blood, or other biological material, had been severely affected by the time her body was recovered. The case therefore depended heavily on testimony and circumstantial evidence. And one name kept returning: John Fite. But investigators were not initially looking at him simply because he was a priest. They were looking at him because of a collection of circumstances. He had heard Irene's last confession. He was among the last known people to see her. He gave investigators accounts of the evening that changed. And then, there was the slide viewer. When police drained the canal area, they found an Eastman Kodak slide viewer, near where they believed Irene's body had been dumped. Police asked the public to help identify it. 2 days later, Fite wrote to police and said the viewer belonged to him. That fact became one of the most peculiar pieces of evidence in the investigation. It did not establish that Fite had killed Irene, but it demanded an explanation. How had his property ended up near the body, and why would he identify it himself? The investigation also uncovered another disturbing connection. 3 weeks before Irene disappeared, a 20-year-old woman named Maria America Guerra had been attacked inside a church in Edinburgh. Guerra later described her attacker as a man with dark hair and horn-rimmed glasses who appeared to be dressed like a priest. She fought back. She escaped. And she eventually identified John Fite from a police lineup. The significance was enormous. Before Irene's murder, Fite had already been accused of attacking a young woman inside a church. And now Irene had disappeared after going to confession with him. Fite denied attacking either woman. He underwent a polygraph examination. The examiner concluded that he was not truthful in his denials. But polygraph results were not enough to solve Irene's murder. The legal system needed more. The Guerra case eventually went to trial in 1961. Fate was charged with attempting to rape her. The jury deadlocked. Rather than face another trial, Fite pleaded no contest to a lesser charge of aggravated assault. He was fined $500. No prison sentence followed, and the Irene Garza murder remained unsolved. This is where the story becomes difficult. Because investigators had a suspect. They had a man who had been accused of attacking another woman. They had inconsistencies in his statements. They had his property near the place where Irene's body had been discovered. They had the fact that he had been the last person known to speak with Irene. And yet they did not have enough, in the eyes of the authorities who ultimately controlled the prosecution, to take him to trial for murder. The case began to cool. Then it went cold. Fate left the Rio Grande Valley. Eventually he left the priesthood. He married. He raised a family. He moved to Arizona. His life continued. Irene's did not. And for her family, the passage of time was not neutral. Every year, another witness. Another memory became less reliable. Another document became harder to locate. Another person who might have known something died. Yet the central question remained exactly where it had been in 1960. What happened to Irene Garza after she entered Sacred Heart Church? For decades, nobody could answer it. Then, in 1963, something happened that would not become public for nearly 40 years. A young priest named Dale Tichenny was working at a Trappist monastery in Missouri. Fite had been sent there after leaving Texas. And according to Tichenny, Fite eventually told him something extraordinary. He claimed Fite described murdering a young woman. The woman had gone to confession. The murder had happened around Easter. And the details, Tichenny later said, haunted him. But Tichenny did not go to police. He said he believed it was not his place to make a judgment. That decision would follow him for the rest of his life. Because the case Tichenny had heard about in 1963 was not just similar to Irene's murder. It was, according to his later testimony, the murder of Irene Garza. But at the time, Tichenny did not know all the details that investigators would later connect. And so the secret remained buried. For 39 years. If you haven't subscribed yet, take 5 seconds to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It is what keeps us going. To understand the murder, we have to separate what is known from what prosecutors later argued happened. The exact sequence inside the church was never captured on camera. There was no surviving eyewitness to the murder itself. There was no modern forensic recording that could reconstruct every minute. What exists is a combination of physical evidence, testimony, statements made by Fite, testimony from witnesses, and the account of a man who said Fite confessed years later. That distinction matters, because the mystery is not simply what prosecutors believed. The mystery is how a jury eventually became convinced beyond a reasonable doubt. On April 16, 1960, Irene went to Sacred Heart Church. She was there for confession. Fite was helping with the Easter services. At some point, Irene entered the rectory. According to Fite's later account, that was where he heard her confession. And according to the prosecution's theory decades later, this was the moment the ordinary religious ritual became a trap. The prosecution argued that Fite attacked Irene inside the rectory. He then had to prevent her from identifying him or surviving. What happened next was brutal. Irene was struck. She was sexually assaulted. And she was suffocated. The precise mechanics of the assault became an important part of the later prosecution case. Dale Tichenny testified that Fite had described using a cellophane bag to suffocate the woman. According to Tichenny's account, Fite said the woman had struggled and had said she could not breathe. But again, this was not a confession recorded in 1960. It was a statement Tichenny said Fite made in 1963. The defense challenged the reliability and meaning of that testimony. That would become one of the central battles of the trial. If Fite had really confessed in 1963, why had he not been reported? Why did Tichenny wait until 2002? Why did the case remain unresolved for more than 5 decades? And could a memory preserved for nearly 40 years be trusted? The prosecution believed the answer was yes, because Tacony was not the only witness. There were the events surrounding the murder itself. There was a slide viewer. There were fights changing accounts. There were scratches observed on his hands shortly after Irene disappeared. Fight explained those scratches by saying he had been locked out of his residence and had climbed toward a second-story window. There was also the Guerra assault, and there was the fact that Guerra had identified Fight as her attacker. The similarities were disturbing. A young woman, a church, a religious setting, an alleged attack from behind, and a priest who became the suspect. The prosecution later argued that this was not coincidence. But in 1960, the authorities still had to build a murder case from evidence that was imperfect. The canal became another piece of the puzzle. The body was found in water. That made the disposal location significant. Someone had moved Irene. Someone had transported her from wherever she died to the canal. And whoever did it apparently left behind an object belonging to John Fight. The green slide viewer was particularly strange because Fight himself identified it. Police had appealed for information. Fight could have remained silent. Instead, he contacted them. That did not prove guilt, but it made investigators ask why. What was Fight doing with the viewer? How did it reach the canal? Was it accidentally lost? Was it placed there? Had it fallen from a vehicle? Or had someone deliberately left it behind? The historical record cannot answer every one of those questions with certainty. But prosecutors in 2017 used the slide viewer as part of the larger circumstantial case. Then there was Fight's account of the confession. At first, investigators understood him to deny hearing Irene's confession. Later, he acknowledged that he had. And when he described the circumstances, he said the confession occurred in the rectory. That mattered, because the location placed Irene alone with him. The rectory was not simply a public church space. It was private. And if the prosecution's theory was correct, privacy was exactly what the killer needed. The sequence proposed by prosecutors was therefore devastatingly simple. Irene entered the church. She met the priest. She entered the rectory. Something happened. She never walked out alive. Later, her belongings appeared along a road. Her body was found in a canal, and an object belonging to the priest was found near the disposal site. The question became transportation. How did Irene get from the church to the canal? At trial, prosecutors argued that Fight had access to a vehicle and opportunity to move her, but the defense emphasized the absence of direct physical proof. No surviving DNA. No fingerprint that conclusively established Fight's presence during the killing. No witness who watched him place Irene in the canal. The case therefore depended on accumulation. One fact alone could be explained. 2 could be coincidences. 3 could still be disputed. But what about 10? What about 15? What about a suspect who had been connected to another violent attack against a young woman weeks earlier? What about a suspect whose statements changed? What about a suspect whose property appeared near the body? What about a former priest who later testified that the suspect confessed to him? The prosecution's argument was that the pieces did not exist independently. They formed a pattern, and that pattern pointed toward fate. But there was another question. Why did the original investigation fail? That question became almost as important as the murder itself. In 1960, investigators were operating in a very different era. Forensic science was nowhere near what it is today. There was no modern DNA profiling. There was no sophisticated digital evidence. No surveillance network. No cell phone records. No computerized databases connecting cases across states. The crime scene was already deteriorating. The body had been in water. The witnesses were young people in 1960 who would become elderly witnesses by 2017. And institutions were different. The power of the Catholic Church in a heavily Catholic community was enormous. Some people later alleged that church officials helped shield fate. Others disputed the extent of that involvement. There were also allegations that authorities failed to pursue the case aggressively enough. But one fact is undeniable. Fate was not arrested for Irene's murder in 1960. He remained free, and the years began to accumulate. By the time the new millennium arrived, Irene had been dead for more than 4 decades, and the man suspected of killing her was living an entirely different life. Then the past finally began speaking. In 2002, Dale Tacony contacted police. His message was explosive. He claimed John Fight had confessed to murdering a young woman. The confession had allegedly occurred in 1963. Tacony said Fight described the attack. He later wrote a letter detailing what he remembered. The Texas Rangers became involved in the renewed investigation. Ranger Rudy Jaramillo worked the case. Investigators began tracking down people who had known Fite, and the investigation began to uncover a second piece of testimony. Father Joseph O'Brien. O'Brien had been around Fite in 1960. He had noticed scratches on Fite's hands. He had heard Fite's explanation, and decades later, O'Brien provided information about what he remembered. The case now had something it had never had in 1960. A witness claimed that Fite had confessed. But the confession had a problem. It was old. Very old. And the man accused of making it denied it. When a CBS 48 Hours investigation confronted Fite in Arizona years later, he denied killing Irene. He also denied knowing who killed her. When told that Tacheny said he had confessed, Fite dismissed Tacheny's account and angrily ended the encounter. He would never publicly confess to Irene's murder. Instead, he maintained his innocence. That meant the prosecution would have to prove the case without a confession from Fite himself. And that is exactly what eventually happened. For more than 50 years, Irene Garza's murder existed in a strange state. It was officially unsolved, but it was not forgotten. People knew the name of the suspect. People knew the story. People knew what the investigators had suspected in 1960. What they did not have was a conviction. In 2002, the case received new life. The Texas Rangers cold case investigation began examining what had happened decades earlier. Rudy Jaramillo became one of the investigators connected to the renewed case. The investigators were now looking at an investigation that had been frozen in another era. They had to find people who were still alive. They had to reconstruct statements. They had to determine which evidence still existed. They had to distinguish memory from fact. And they had to answer the question that had defeated earlier investigators. Could the evidence against John Fite actually survive in court? Dale Tacheny was central. He said Fite had confessed to him in 1963, but Tacheny's delay was enormous. Nearly 40 years had passed before he contacted authorities. Why? Tacheny said he had believed it was not his place to judge. He later expressed regret. He acknowledged that he had effectively kept information about the crime to himself. That made his testimony both powerful and vulnerable. Powerful because he was describing an alleged confession made long before the case became a public sensation. Vulnerable because the jury had to decide whether his memory remained reliable. And then came another problem. The original district attorney, Irene Garza, did not believe the evidence was strong enough. In 2004, the case went before a grand jury. Fite was not indicted. The case stalled again. For Irene's family, this was devastating. They had already waited more than 4 decades. Now the possibility of justice had appeared, and disappeared again. But the story was not over. Public interest increased. Media investigations revisited the case. Irene's family continued speaking. And eventually, the case became a political issue in Hidalgo County. In 2014, Ricardo Rodriguez challenged Garza for district attorney. Rodriguez campaigned in part on a promise to revisit the Irene Garza case. He won. And once he took office in January 2015, the investigation moved again. This time, prosecutors believed the evidence had to be reconsidered with fresh eyes. The old evidence was still there. The old testimony was still there. But the people evaluating it were different. And the question was no longer whether the case could have been prosecuted in 1960. The question was whether it could be prosecuted now. In February 2016, John Fite was indicted. He was living in Scottsdale, Arizona. He was 83 years old. For the first time in more than half a century, the man who had been the central suspect in Irene's murder was facing a courtroom. Fite was extradited to Texas, and the countdown to trial began. But the passage of time created an extraordinary legal problem. The prosecution was asking jurors to reconstruct events from 1960. The defense could point to the age of the evidence. Witness memories had faded. Some witnesses had died. The physical evidence was decades old. And the defense could make a devastatingly simple argument. Where is the forensic evidence? There was no DNA connecting Fite to the murder. There was no modern scientific test that could place him at the canal. There was no eyewitness to the killing. The defense therefore argued that prosecutors had suspicion, but not proof. The prosecution saw it differently. They did not need one magical piece of evidence. They needed a chain. And at the center of that chain was Dale Tacheny. When the trial began in late November 2017, the courtroom became a time machine. Witnesses who had been young in 1960 were now elderly. Evidence that had once been ordinary objects was now treated as historical artifacts. Photographs from the original investigation were displayed. The prosecution presented the story of a woman who went to church and never came home. The defense challenged the reliability of old evidence. The jury heard about Maria America Guerra. She had survived an attack inside a church only weeks before Irene's murder. She had identified Fight. Fight had eventually pleaded no contest to aggravated assault and received a $500 fine. For prosecutors, the connection suggested a pattern. For the defense, it was an unrelated event that could unfairly prejudice the jury. Then came the physical evidence. The slide viewer. The object found near the canal. A small piece of property that had survived longer than many of the people who had first handled it. Fight had identified it as his. The defense could not deny that. But ownership was not the same as murder. The prosecution had to explain how that object fit into the larger story. Then came testimony about Fight's scratches. A former priest remembered seeing scratches on Fight's hands after Irene disappeared. Fight had explained them by saying he had been locked out of his residence and had climbed toward a second-story window. Again, there was no photograph showing that the scratches came from a struggle with Irene. There was only the timing and the explanation. The defense emphasized that. Then the courtroom heard from people who had been involved in the original investigation. One former reporter, Daryl Davis, testified about what he remembered from 1960. He had been a young reporter at the time. Decades later, his memories were part of the historical record. And then came the testimony that the prosecution had been waiting for. Dale Tacheny took the stand. He was an elderly man. The man sitting across the courtroom from him was an elderly man too. But Tacheny was not describing an event from his old age. He was describing a conversation from 1963. According to Tacheny, Fight had come to him troubled, and Fight had allegedly described killing a young woman. Tacheny told the jury what he remembered. He said Fight described attacking the woman after hearing her confession. He said Fight described binding and gagging her. He said Fight described suffocating her. And he described details that prosecutors argued matched the known circumstances of Irene's death. At one point, the testimony became especially disturbing. Tacheny said Fight had been haunted by the sound of a woman's heels. A sound that, according to the testimony, reminded him of what had happened. The defense attacked Tacheny's credibility. Why wait 39 years? Why should a jury believe a memory that old? Why did Tacheny initially give investigators information that was not perfectly aligned with the known facts? Could his memory have changed over time? These were not minor questions. They were the heart of the defense. Because if Tacheny's testimony collapsed, the prosecution's case became much more heavily circumstantial. But the prosecution had something else. A recorded conversation. Years earlier, in 2003, investigators had arranged for Tacheny to speak with Fight. The conversation was recorded. Tacheny confronted Fight about what he said had happened decades earlier. Fight denied killing Irene. He said he was not the man who killed her. But prosecutors could point to the fact that Fight did not simply respond as someone hearing a completely unknown accusation. The defense, of course, had its own interpretation. A denial was a denial, and no recording captured Fight confessing to the murder. The jury had to weigh all of it. The testimony, the physical evidence, the history, the inconsistencies, the earlier assault, the alleged confession, and the absence of DNA. Then the defense made its final appeal. John Fight had not taken the stand. At one point, he had considered testifying, but after consulting with his attorneys, he decided against it. His decision left the jury with no direct testimony from the defendant, explaining the night Irene disappeared. The defense argued that the prosecution had failed to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. They reminded jurors that suspicion was not proof. They pointed out that the physical evidence did not scientifically establish Fight's presence at the murder scene, and they argued that the prosecution had built a case on evidence that had become weaker through the passage of time. The prosecution responded with the opposite argument. They told jurors to look at the entire picture. Not one clue. All of them. A priest, a young woman, a private confession, a disappearance, a body, a slide viewer, changing statements, an earlier attack, a witness who said Fight confessed, and decades of behavior that prosecutors said were consistent with guilt. Assistant District Attorney Mike Garza described Fight in brutally direct terms. He argued that Fight had been a predator hiding behind the appearance of a priest. The defense rejected that characterization. The jury retired to deliberate. For Irene's family, the moment was almost unbearable. They had been waiting since 1960. Parents who had once reported their daughter missing were long gone. Friends had aged. Investigators had retired. The suspect himself was 85, but Irene was still 25 in the photographs. She had never aged. The jury returned on December 7, 2017. John Fite stood in the courtroom. The verdict was read. Guilty. After 57 years, the case was no longer officially unresolved. The man who had been suspected from the beginning had finally been convicted. But the story still had one final chapter: punishment. The prosecution had asked the jury for a sentence that would symbolically recognize the years Irene's family had waited. 57 years. The number of years between the murder and the conviction. But the jury went further. John Fite was sentenced to life in prison. He was 85 years old. The sentence meant that the former priest who had spent more than half a century outside prison would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. For Irene's family, the verdict was not celebration. It was closure, mixed with grief. Because nothing could restore 1960. Nothing could give Irene back her youth. Nothing could give her parents another conversation with their daughter. Nothing could erase the years they spent wondering whether the truth would ever be known. The conviction answered one question, but it also left others. Why did it take 57 years? Why did investigators fail to secure a murder prosecution in 1960? Why was the suspect able to leave the area? Why did Dale Tacheny wait nearly 4 decades before contacting authorities? What role did church officials play in Fite's movements after the murder? And could Irene have received justice much earlier? These questions have generated controversy ever since. There have been allegations that church officials wanted Fite removed from the area rather than prosecuted. There have also been allegations that local officials were unwilling to confront the Catholic hierarchy. But those claims should be treated carefully. The historical record contains testimony and allegations about institutional decisions, but not every allegation has been established as fact. What is established is that Fite left the Rio Grande Valley. He eventually left the priesthood. He married. He raised a family. And for decades, he lived as a private citizen, while Irene's murder remained unsolved. The conviction finally changed that. But Fite never publicly admitted responsibility for Irene's death. Even when confronted years before his arrest, he denied killing her. And when he stood trial, the prosecution had to prove the case without a direct confession from him. The jury concluded that the evidence was sufficient. That verdict remains the legal conclusion of the case. 2 years later, another chapter closed. On February 12, 2020, John Fite died in prison at the age of 87. He had been serving his life sentence. His preliminary cause of death was reported as cardiac arrest. His death did not erase the conviction, nor did it erase the questions surrounding the case. But it meant that the man convicted of murdering Irene Garza would never walk out of prison again. And perhaps the most haunting part of Irene's story is that the final answer was never really about one moment. It was about time. Time allowed evidence to fade. Time allowed witnesses to disappear. Time allowed memories to become uncertain. Time allowed a suspect to build another life. But time also preserved fragments. A slide viewer, a police report, an old photograph, a witness's memory, a letter, a recorded conversation, and the determination of a family that refused to let Irene become nothing more than a name in an old newspaper. For decades, the photograph of Irene remained frozen. Her dark hair, her youthful face, her expression. The woman in that photograph never knew what was coming. She did not know that her final trip to church would become one of the most infamous cold cases in Texas. She did not know that a priest would become the central suspect. She did not know that investigators would spend years asking the same questions. She did not know that her family would wait more than half a century for a verdict. And she certainly could not have known that the man eventually convicted of her murder would still be alive when that verdict finally came. But there is one thing the passage of time could not change. Irene Garza went into Sacred Heart Church on April 16, 1960. She expected to go home. She never did. For 5 days, her family did not know where she was. For 57 years, they did not know whether the man they suspected would ever be held accountable. And for decades, the truth seemed to be disappearing beneath the weight of history. Then, one by one, the pieces returned. The evidence, the witnesses, the memories, the investigation, the courtroom, and finally, the verdict. Guilty. The case that began with a young woman entering a church ended with an elderly man being led away to prison. But perhaps the most important name in this story is not John Fite. It is Irene. Because before she became a victim, she was a person. She was a daughter whose parents waited for her to come home. She was a teacher whose students knew her. She was a friend whose absence was immediately felt. She was a woman of faith who believed she was walking into a sacred place. And she was only 25 years old. 57 years later, a jury finally spoke for her. And although justice came impossibly late, the mystery that had haunted McAllen for generations finally had an answer. Irene Garza went to confession. She never came home. And for more than half a century, the silence that followed her disappearance was almost as terrifying as the crime itself. But silence does not always mean a secret is gone. Sometimes it means someone is still carrying it. Sometimes it means the evidence is still waiting. And sometimes, after decades have passed, the past finds a way to speak. Irene Garza's story is one of those cases. A young woman entered a church in 1960. A body emerged from a canal 5 days later. And 57 years after her final confession, a jury finally gave the family an answer. Her name was Irene Garza, and she was not forgotten. If you enjoyed watching this case, like the video and subscribe to the channel for more cold case updates.